Inspections. This is a big part here. So top of the box, we've got 177. Buyer waives their right to have an independent inspection. So that means if you click that box and the buyer agrees to that they cannot have an inspector go out there. They cannot get out of the contract if they find anything. They're not going to find anything because they're not doing an inspection. So they really can't get out of the contract at all. They're okay to take the house completely as is. I do not recommend that unless the buyer is very aware of what's going on, or they're a seasoned investor and they own property, are comfortable buying property while waiving the inspection. Or maybe if the house is new, you can do that. It really just depends on the situation, but more often than not, you're not going to want to advise your client in that option. I always like to add, so I'm using dot loops. You can go up here and you can add a checkbox or initials, and I would make your buyer initial right there, just so you can say, I pointed that out to them, we talked about that, and they knew what they were doing, because sometimes that can get really sticky. So let's say your buyer does want an inspection. That's awesome. The buyer's going to pay for the inspection. They're going to have any inspection they want on the property. And you're going to put in here 16 is common for our area. Again, check with your broker on your local things that are good for you. But typically we put in here 16 days that the buyer is going to have time to do an inspection on the property. We also will put down here in this next box on line 207 is that the buyer will have 5 additional days if they find something, and I'm just going to read you this line here. If the initial inspection report reveals the presence of lead-based paint, radon, mold, and other biological contaminants, or any other condition that requires further examination or testing, then the buyer shall notify the seller in writing and have 5 days. So really that could be like a foundation thing. I mean, that could be obviously mold, biological contaminants, radon, any of that stuff. It's kind of a gray area. As long as there's a lot going on with the property, you're going to be able to have access to that. My advice, have your buyer get the inspection done as quickly as possible, and just do everybody a favor and stay inside of this 16-day window. And that way you don't even need to get into the extra 5 days if you need it. Check out my video on inspection responses, and I went through all of those, so you can check those out. Limited home warranty. Here, this is if the buyer wants a warranty on the property. Home warranty is going to be a policy that the buyer can purchase, or they can have the seller purchase, that is underneath or in addition to homeowners insurance. So you're going to have homeowners insurance, which is going to cover, fire, flood, lightning strikes, tree falls on my house, big stuff. A home warranty is going to cover smaller stuff, like if the appliances go bad, or if there's a small leak that needs fixed, or some plumbing stuff happens, or water heater goes out, or the furnace goes bad. It's going to cover the smaller stuff. There's a ton of different home warranty programs out there. I'm sure you can check with local leadership and you can figure out what home warranty program is best for you to recommend to your clients, but there's a ton of them out there. Let's say your client wants one. You would check this box here that they do want a home warranty. The cost of the home warranty will not exceed $650, and let's say that the buyer is going to pay for it and the buyer is going to order it. You can have the seller pay for it, you can have the seller order it. Just check the appropriate boxes. Sales disclosures. So it's important here that if your property has sales disclosures, whether that's a seller's disclosure or lead-based paint or both, that you have had your buyer check those over either during the time when you're going to send them the purchase agreement or prior to you sending them the purchase agreement. So if they have, then you would check has and has. Good for you. Everybody's moving on. Title approval here. This is going to say that you want standard typical title insurance in the house to be free and clear of any liens or judgments. An abstract of title, I don't even know. I mean, I've seen a few of those, but they're super old way of doing it. No one really does that anymore, and I'm sure they would charge you an arm and a leg if you wanted that. So a title insurance policy is what you need. Owner's title insurance typically is paid by the seller. Lender's title insurance typically paid by the buyer. You can switch those around, do whatever you want, but typically that's how it will work. And the parties agree that either the seller will order title work. It's very common in our area for the seller to pick, or the seller's agent really is who's picking, and that you want them to order that immediately. So where if there's any sort of title liens or judgment, that your buyer is not already through an inspection, already through an appraisal, and they've got money invested in this property, to come find out that the seller can't even really sell it to them, or the seller owes too much money on the property and they can't convey title to the property. Next, line 282. So this is different tax situations that you can do. So this purchase agreement is specific to Indiana, and most often what you're going to check here is that you want all the prior calendar year taxes to be caught up, and you to get a credit at the time of closing for any taxes that were due in the past. In Indiana, we pay them in arrears, so taxes that are paid in May and November are taxes that were actually accumulated for the prior year. So what this does is the seller is going to give your buyer a tax credit all the way to the day of closing. If you were to check box 1 here, you're going to pick a date, and then the buyer is going to get a credit to specified date, not to the closing date. And then for recent construction down here, box 3, you could do, a lot of times when you go to buy a new construction home, the property taxes are not yet assessed. That takes some time before that actually happens. So the buyer could request that the builder give them $1,000, $2,000, $3,000 to cover future taxes that are going to happen on the property, because land taxes are very, very minimal. Homeowners Association here, typically we will put 5, 5, and 5 in all 3 of these boxes as you go through here. So what that means is that the seller has 5 days after the acceptance of the agreement to give the buyer the HOA documents. The buyer has 5 days to approve of those documents from the date of receipt. And then if there's any approval required by an association, that they would have to be obtained within 5 days after buyer's approval of documents. So those timelines kind of run in a chain reaction. Fair housing, so nobody can discriminate, based on anything. You can't say, oh, I want this type of person to live in my house or to buy my house, or I want this type of buyer to live in that area. None of that works. You don't get to pick. Additional provisions. So here, this is be the website, line 359. If you think the house might have been a meth lab or something, or been cleaned for meth, you can check it there. Line 361 shows if you feel like there's a sex offender in the area. I guess that was a weird way of saying that, but you can check and see if there's a sex offender in the area at that website. And as you kind of scroll down here, you can read through this boilerplate so you understand that what's there. If your buyer has a real estate license, they'll put it right here in this box. And further conditions, this is where you list anything that's not already laid out in the contract. So sometimes you could put in there, like the play set that I mentioned earlier could go in there, the hot tub could go in there. Maybe there's a lawn tractor or something that somebody wants, that could go in the further conditions. Really anything that's just addition. This is for you to use, I don't want to say creative space because you don't really want to get creative, but anything that's outside of the normal, you would put it here in the further conditions. Acknowledgements. So if your the house that you're buying is listed by you, then you would put that this is a limited agency transaction. Or if it's listed by somebody on your team, so let's say you're on a team and somebody else on the team has the listing, you would put that it's a limited agency transaction. If it's not, then you would check it's not. Pretty simple as that. Expiration of the offer. Typically right now in this environment, we're giving sellers 24 hours to respond to an offer. In previous markets, we've done as little as 2 or 3 hours, but right now it's very common for the buyer to give the seller 24 hours to decide on an offer. And then you'll have your buyer sign. The seller will respond on what they want to do. And we've made it through the entire Indiana State Purchase Agreement. If you have any questions about that, please check with your local leadership on that. This is not the end-all be-all. This is just going to get you through and give you a really great jump start on what's there. And of course, if you have any other questions, you can message me as well. Thanks for watching. Make sure you click subscribe.